are also building up their forces. To outsiders, at first, the Soviets seem well equipped and well prepared. Against them, the Mujahideen are poorly armed. They retreat into the mountain areas they know well. So in Vietnam, both Westmoreland and Giap have met the buildup requirement in the battle plan for guerrilla warfare. But in Afghanistan, in retreating to the mountains, the Mujahideen are, in essence, choosing the battleground on which the war will be fought. And now, as the commanders meet the next requirement in the battle plan for guerrilla warfare, this battleground becomes crucial. Attrition. Both sides must execute what military theorists call the attritional stage of the campaign, trying to wear down the other side. In Vietnam, how General Westmoreland views hearts and minds, and how he views the makeup of Giap's regular and irregular forces, will now determine how he executes this next stage of his battle plan. And how Giap decides to use the two prongs of his attacking forces, his North Vietnamese regular army and his South Vietnamese guerrilla army, will also depend on how quickly he wants to move to the next requirement, the transition from attrition to conventional warfare. In deciding his strategy, Westmoreland has to plan against Giap's two types of force. And for the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies, this presents a problem.
On the one hand, they had to defend against the conventional forces of North Vietnam. On the other hand, they had to wage a counter-guerrilla campaign against the Viet Cong.
Westmoreland has to decide the type of campaign he will use: conventional warfare, or counterinsurgency, or a balance of both. As he plans, it's the existence of Giap's regular North Vietnamese army which has the greatest impact on how Westmoreland and his advisors think.
The existence of a large and powerful North Vietnamese army fed the American prejudice in favor of seeing the entire conflict in conventional terms. In particular, it meant that those within the American camp who wanted resources for the counter-guerrilla campaign found themselves marginalized.
And this is also affected by the buildup of U.S. troops. Once they are committed, the Americans very quickly increase their forces. In 1962, there are some 2,000 American troops in Vietnam. By 1969, there are more than 500,000.
This is almost part of the American problem. They have all of those troops in Vietnam, particularly in southern Vietnam, and they need to use them. And of course, the military are far better at fighting violent operations than hearts and minds. And this is, of course, where the counterinsurgency plan that the Americans devise eventually moves to. It moves to violence rather than to the hearts and minds scenario.
So Westmoreland's decision is to treat Vietnam not as a counterinsurgency war, but a conventional one. At this stage, for both Giap and Westmoreland, attrition, wearing down the opposition, is the key to the war. But attrition means different things to each man. For Giap, it is to convince the U.S. that it can never win. For Westmoreland, it is to destroy his enemy physically.
In the case of the communists, this was a strategy of frustration. Their aim was to convince the Americans that they could not win and that they should therefore leave the country. In the case of the Americans, it was a strategy of pure attrition, one that involved the killing of the largest possible number of enemy soldiers.
But General Giap's decision to combine the two types of warfare, using his North Vietnamese army and his Viet Cong irregulars, also presents Westmoreland with an additional problem. His men have to force Giap's insurgents out of the jungle, but this is terrain which the Americans find very difficult.
The Americans, because they were moving in this inhospitable terrain, often found themselves ambushed. the insurgents, the guerrilla forces, held the initiative, and the Americans were often slaughtered as they tried to move through the jungles and tried to just find out where the enemy were.
Until 1965, Giap's strategy appears to be succeeding. But in that year, he makes one of his biggest mistakes. In the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the attritional phase of the guerrilla war begins almost immediately. It is David against Goliath, one of the world's most powerful armies with immensely sophisticated weapons, up against an enemy with only light arms. But the Mujahideen understand immediately what they have to do.
They had to take to the hills, to the caves, to the rugged mountains. They needed to use the terrain to their best ability to maintain the initiative, to pull the Soviets into that terrain and to ambush them. It was classic guerrilla warfare territory, and the Afghans knew exactly what they were doing.
At first, the Soviet planners are dangerously over-reliant on the roads, which makes them vulnerable to ambush and does nothing to defeat the guerrillas who remain secure in their mountain bases. Then the Soviets change tactics. They continue to use large-scale operations, but make increasing use of heliborne missions to strike into the mountains. Mujahideen attacking convoys find themselves being ambushed. By 1983, these new Soviet methods have put the Mujahideen on the back foot. Although the vast majority of the Soviet fighting in Afghanistan still has to be done by its relatively poorly trained and poorly motivated conscript army, the key troops in this apparently winning new tactic are the Soviet Spetsnaz Special Forces units. They provide the muscle for the heliborne deep penetration raids and ambushes. These are directed by specially trained Spetsnaz troops who disguise themselves as Mujahideen so as to operate for long periods behind the lines, gathering information and locating guerrilla strongholds for airstrikes. The Mujahideen find themselves being pinned down and unable to operate in the open. Their hit-and-run tactics are no longer working. It's looking as if the aggressive use of the helicopter and special forces has given the Soviets a way to neutralize the guerrillas. Air mobility allows them to access inhospitable terrain and get to grips with the enemy. But all this is about to change. Afghanistan, the mid-1980s, and Vietnam in the mid-1960s. It's the point in the war where, according to the traditional theories, commanders must meet the next phase in the battle plan for guerrilla warfare. Transition. Moving from guerrilla hit-and-run tactics to large-scale conventional war. In Algeria, the guerrillas did not change tactics from hit-and-run to conventional warfare. But the French did. Previously, specific troops were responsible for each region. From 1958, the French used mobile forces on massive search and destroy missions against the guerrillas, in the mountains, but also in the city of Algiers itself. By 1959, the French appeared to have put down the guerrillas. They appeared to control Algiers. This uneasy peace was as close to military victory as they would get. In Vietnam in 1965, General Giap decides to make the critical transition from guerrilla to conventional tactics. He aims to confront the US and South Vietnamese forces in conventional combat and try to overthrow the South Vietnamese government rapidly. The tactic merely makes his forces easier targets for massive American firepower. But this miscalculation has an unexpected result. It confirms Westmoreland's belief that the way to win is by conventional and not counterinsurgency warfare.
Although the premature attempt to transition to conventional operations must be counted as one of the great mistakes of the Vietnamese communists, it had the benefit of feeding the existing American prejudice that the war was primarily a conventional struggle.
During 1965 and 66, in spite of using conventional tactics in a counterinsurgency scenario, Westmoreland is inflicting massive casualties on GIAP's insurgents, and especially GIAP's guerrilla forces. After suffering huge losses, particularly from U.S. air power, in battles on the Bantangan Peninsula and the Ia Drang Valley, and the siege of Plei Me Special Forces Base, GIAP is losing. Now he changes tactics again. He decides to introduce a massive political dimension into his campaign. His aim is to turn the tables on the U.S. and South Vietnamese governments by taking the war in Vietnam into the living rooms of America. In 1954, General GIAP had altered the course of politics in the region by annihilating the French base at Dien Bien Phu. This victory had a major impact on the Geneva Conference, which decided the future shape of the region. Now GIAP aims to overwhelm the U.S. Marine base at Khe Sanh as a dramatic demonstration that the North Vietnamese are still a powerful and determined enemy. But the siege of Khe Sanh is only one part of General GIAP's new strategy. On January 30th, 1968, the Vietnamese New Year festival of Tet, he sends both irregular and conventional forces into 36 South Vietnamese cities and towns, previously thought to be outside his striking range, including the capital, Saigon. The communist troops are effectively on a suicide mission, for they have no heavy equipment and must face an overwhelming enemy response. But initially, they seem to be rampaging everywhere. A squad even breaches the outer wall of the American embassy in Saigon. The embassy itself is not in danger, but television images of dead Viet Cong inside the compound suggest otherwise. In the ancient city of Hue, the fighting between communist troops and U.S. Marines is street by street, sometimes house to house. General GIAP's forces suffer enormous casualties. By the end of February, U.S. forces have eliminated all communist infiltrators in the cities, and on April 6th, they relieve the siege of Khe Sanh. But in America itself, the political impact of the television images and news stories about the Tet Offensive is massive. And on the streets, the anti-war movement is gathering strength. General GIAP has lost the military battle, but he is on course to win the long-term political one. In Afghanistan in the mid-1980s, the balance of war is also changing. The more involved the Soviet Union becomes, the more the rest of the world, and particularly the United States, is taking an interest. Until now, the Mujahideen have been losing their guerrilla war against the Soviets. But that is about to alter dramatically. Afghanistan in the mid-1980s. The Mujahideen